Hello, I'm the Pink Phantom, and this is my podcast. Join me as I delve into the world of games and gaming, and especially old school RPGs. Together, let's voyage into the astral realm and check out my Phantom Thoughts. In this episode, we hear from Daniel from the Bandits Keep podcast. I make an inquiry to the judgment and wisdom of my listeners, and we're going to talk about that battle with the gnolls in Tales of the Dragon Slayers.
Hey, Big Phantom. Daniel from Bandits Keep calling in. I guess I did not call back about the fudging. Lots of great calls there. Like everyone else, I'll say up front, how you play the game is how you play the game. No judgment. But I don't want to get into whether or not I like fudging or not. What I'd rather do is actually, there was something that Riley said that was really interesting, I thought, which I wholeheartedly agree with, which is that systems that have you basically dead at zero make it more difficult to moderate the game in a sense, right? Because if you're playing, let's say, BX and you run by the rules and you say, well, you're dead at zero. I mean, how do you capture somebody? How do you knock them out if you just have orcs against the PCs, right? You either have to house rule something or make a ruling or something to that effect. Whereas a system where you just say defeated at zero, which is how I do it in my games, or even AD&D where you're unconscious at 0 to I think -5 or something, and then you start really dying after that to -10, I think was where you end up. I think that actually makes it easier to adjudicate something where the orcs knock you over the head, you're -3, you're bleeding out, but one of them drags you off to the side kind of thing, right? Or, maybe the bleeding out isn't even great, right? Maybe just the unconscious. I'm not sure, but I think that helps because I think that where we see this a lot as far as people justifying the fudging is I set the encounter difficulty too dangerous, or the dice went bad for the players and it kind of ended up not being fair. And if you want to lean into that as a rationale, I get it. But I think also just having a mechanic where, okay, well, the dice went against them, but we can also make this a shot that knocks them out or they're captured. Just is a little bit more palatable, I think, for people that don't want to have TPKs or don't want player characters to die in more narratively driven stories where it might just be more complicated to handle that. So what they do is effectively, and this is what I consider fudging, they make a roll in secret and then they basically say the roll is something other than it was. This is the part that I don't really love. I think that, like many people kind of chimed in, it's the keeping it from the players that kind of rubs me the wrong way. I think if you look at the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, and there was a debate between myself and Redcaps whether or not this was actually fudging, take it as you will. Gygax has a part in it where he talks about if the players have done everything right or they're playing well or whatever, and the dice just happen to go against them. It's just have a bad dice day, things just don't go well. You could always have some other consequence instead of death. I don't have the DMG in front of me, but I think he actually mentioned something like losing an arm, which is pretty serious. But at the same time, if you analyze how that would happen at the table, it's very likely that the player is going to know that you did that, right? It's not something that you just go, you roll, you look down, you roll the natural 20, but you're 7, they miss you. Literally, they're going to know that they got hit and that their arm's torn off. So, and I feel like at my table, the way that would go would be, you roll the hit, you roll the damage, you're 8 points of damage, and the player says, oh man, that kills my character. And then I think, you know what, the dice are just hate you today. What if instead of that, it shatters your magic sword or breaks your arm or knocks you unconscious and throws you, down into the pit of mud where they're going to drag you out and capture you, and now you're going to be captive of the ogres. And I think at that point the player can actually be part of it. They understand what's going on. They're okay with it in theory. I guess if a player said, no, I want to be dead, well, I guess that's also fine. But it allows for it to be more of an open conversation versus the Dungeon Master just making the call. I think that's where I don't love the fudging. Some of the other circumstances where I think it would come up that aren't really fudging, but that I don't love, but I think, again, could be adjudicated differently, are things like I'm going to give the monster more hit points because the fight's not going along enough. I feel like that is taking something away from the players, especially if they just got lucky with the dice. And again, I know it's I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth because I'm saying when the dice are unlucky, we should maybe save them, maybe. But if the dice are lucky, they should just have them. But I think that's okay. The world is weighted against the player characters, and I think that if they get real lucky and they take out the boss monster fast. I mean, I've had this happen on many occasions. I know it's anecdotal, but I've never had a player say to me, well, that was boring because we killed him so fast. They're always excited that they did it or surprised that they killed it so easily. So again, I don't think that would be a problem with my player group. But again, maybe some tables would hate that. They'd be like, well, we came this time planning on running a 4-hour battle and it was only 20 minutes and now we're unsatisfied. If you play with that kind of group, I guess then that would be okay. And that's probably something, as others had said, that maybe is worth talking about ahead of time. The other end of it, where the orcs or whatever are clearly going to lose, you can pretty easily adjudicate that by just having them surrender, or again, being open with the table and saying, in fact, this is how my game operates. It's in the rules of my game, is that if you reach a point where the enemy just cannot win, because that can happen in my case, there's no way that even a lucky roll can take them over the top, then you just end the combat there and narrate it out. And that came to me because that's what I do, right? I'll say, listen, you guys are 8th level, there's only 3 orcs left, but I rolled them around, they're not going to run, so what we're going to do here is just tell me how you killed them, right? It's like I don't really have a problem doing that, and the players know I'm doing it, so you see a theme here. It's all about that conversation, I think, for me. As far as what you were talking about, as far as like adjusting an encounter after something happens, like you have an encounter with 5 goblins and it's way more deadly than you thought. The next room has 10 goblins, so you decide, better make this one 3. I think that's okay. I don't think that's really fudging in the sense that it hasn't got to the players yet. It's not that you said there was 10 in the room and then suddenly change it to 3. You change it before they get there. Thus, in the fiction, it doesn't exist. I think that if I was going to do that, though, I wouldn't just have those extra 7 goblins disappear. They would just be somewhere else. I would just space them out and rearrange how the goblins are, because it's not like they're standing in stasis in one room, right? You kind of put them there as an idea, but in total you have 23 goblins in the compound. There was going to be, 5 and then 10. You can just do 5 and then 3 and then 3 and then 3 and then 2 and 5 and 2 and, whatever. So you can actually make it so it works. Anyways, that is an incredibly long message, but I think that was really cool. I'm still listening to the Dragon Slayers, but always enjoy it. I'm about 2 rooms into it. I like that they're exploring a new level now. So if they're going up, is this, maybe you're going to say it, but is that level 2? I hope so, because I want to see what happens when they start encountering some really nasty monsters, because you've definitely had some things like, the ones that fall on your head. For the lack of my brain can't think of what they're called. But those are pretty tough, so you've had those on the first level of the dungeon, so let's see what awaits them in the future. Excellent stuff. I'll talk to you soon.
Hey, Daniel, thanks for the call. Yeah, I think it's probably a good dividing line from what everyone's been saying, that fudging takes place when the challenge is active. So if you're in the middle of something, in the middle of a puzzle, and in the middle of a trap, in the middle of a combat encounter, in the middle of a social encounter, you don't just suddenly start changing things in the middle, because they are what they are. Whatever the players walk in the door to, that's what's there. And then if you make adjustments outside of that purview before the players even encounter something, then that's not fudging, although depending on who you talk to, that's considered good or bad. And I like your idea of, no, the threat is going to be the same. It will just be spread out more. I think that actually mirrors what I've been doing with the Tales of the Dragon Slayer, where I'll roll up if a creature's lair is somewhere in the dungeon, and then if it is, they'll get the big numbers that you see in the monster manual if it's one of the humanoid type creatures, but they're not all in one place. They're spread out, so the players would encounter them in smaller groups. So I really like that concept. As far as what is second level, yeah, I do consider it second level now. Early on in the dungeon exploration process, where they actually went up a couple of levels chasing the orcs, I wasn't thinking of it in that concept. They did end up facing a pretty nasty creature up at the top, and they encountered some different type of creatures that haven't encountered much of anywhere else in the dungeon. So it is still a very different level. The challenge level was maybe not considered as high because I was still rolling on that, I think, that first level chart for most of them. But I am considering now whether you go up a level or down a level or up two or down two, it's going to be like it's the second level, the third level, what have you, to get a little more variety and also to get, of course, the additional challenge of the second level of the dungeon is more challenging than the first level of the dungeon. And I'm even alternating using the charts in the DMG with the charts, encounter charts that are in the back of Monster Manual 2, which has creatures from the Monster Manual 2, and Fiend Folio. So another way to get a variety of creatures and get a little more just different combat encounters, so you're not just constantly running into orcs. Although again, me using uh, the larger groups that I have, they're going to end up running into a lot of orcs and dwarves and gnomes and things like that. And that actually is playing out as they're exploring this new level. They're actually running into a lot more of one type of creature because of some of the encounters they've had. I'm trying to kind of develop on themes now where if they run across, say, one of those groups' lair areas, that there will be more of those groups around that lair area a little more often. So just a little more experimentation, a little more development of what I've been doing, developing the process a little more. So that's what's going on there. So thank you for asking. Thank you for calling in as always. It's always good to hear from you. And now I have a question for the group mind. And the other thing that I just remembered that you talked about that I wanted to respond to was the creatures that keep dropping on the characters. Those are piercers, and yeah, they are nasty creatures. I'm amazed that they're in the first level of dungeons, because they can be anywhere from 1 to 4 hit dice, and really anything. I mean, a 1 hit dice with a good hit damage roll could take out a first level character, but second, third, fourth, 4 hit die creature. Of course, now the flip side of that is they move slow. They have a 1-inch movement. So I think the idea is they get one attack and then the characters kind of beat them to death. But they also have a 95% chance of surprise. And one of the first things I had to figure out was, what does that even mean? Because I mean, surprise is 1 or 2 on a 6-sided dice usually, and the number you roll if you're surprised is the number of segments that the other side gets to use as rounds. So if you roll 2, they get 2. So how does 95% work? And I wasn't going to use percentile dice because I mean 95 segments, that's a long time. So what I ended up doing was I roll a d20, and then but they do get that many segments. But because they are they're dropping from above, they're supposed to look like stalactites essentially, and so going from that, I just kind of intuited after the first time I had them that they would be in cave-like structures. They'd have to be at least 20 feet high, maybe taller. And so only moving an inch, 10 feet at a time, after that initial attack, it would take them time to climb, to get to the wall, climb back up the wall, and then get back in position. So even though they might get up to 19 segments of attacks, and I think that did actually happen in an encounter. It was 18 or 19. It was right at the edge. It's going to take, depending on how tall the ceiling is, it could take them 3 segments just to climb the wall. And if they end up falling, say, only 10 feet away, if the character's only 10 feet away from a wall, they're going to fall. They're going to go 10 feet to get to the wall, 20 or 30 feet up the wall, and then 10 feet over. So you're talking about 4 or 5 segments before they can get their next attack in. So 19 segments of attack is not going to give them 19 attacks. It's going to give them 3 or 4 or 5, depending on how tall things are. And I've been using just 30 feet as a standard, since they're inside. Since this keep is inside a hill, it's a room where, if it's a room where they are, it's a room where they broke into whoever made the keep broke into a natural cave and just kind of built some walls around the lower level, and then up high, you've got this ceiling. But yeah, they are pretty nasty creatures. They've come up, I don't know if it's 3 times or 4 times, maybe 5. But they've come up several times. One of the times they didn't get surprised. They actually rolled a 20 on the D20. So, and so, and because they move slow, once that surprise is over, it's, and they don't have tremendous armor class. So they're not extremely hard to hit, especially for this group with the magic weapons they have. So they get dispatched pretty quickly once the party can get a hold of them. It's just surviving the initial surprise rounds that's interesting about those creatures. So now let me get to the question for the group mind. This episode's topic, I guess, for lack of a better term, was inspired by reading through the playtest document for the Tales of Argosa game that's currently on Kickstarter. It's the essentially version 2 of low fantasy gaming. And as part of the What is Tales of Argosa page, it says that Tales of Argosa has simple rules. In a 240 some odd page document. Now, admittedly, some of those are spell descriptions, and there are weapon descriptions, and there are monsters, although I think the part about monsters only takes about 4 or 5 pages. But within some of those entries are sections that apply to the rules that indicate how they interface with the other rules of the system. And even if you take into account things like illustrations, what the page count is on that, and other items that are just descriptive and not so much have mechanics mixed in, you're still looking at, even if you're being conservative, 100 to 150 pages of rules. Now, admittedly, some of those will not apply to players. The number of rules that players will have to deal with are relatively small, but the game master is going to have to deal with pretty much all of them at some point. And the individual rules themselves are probably pretty simple, and you can have a core mechanic says the game design is wrapped around a D20 core. But at some point, at what point do having a lot of simple rules add up to not being simple rules? To just it's a rule book, it's a robust, fairly complex system, and it doesn't. The word simple just doesn't apply anymore. I know I'm not talking about rules light. I think that's something entirely different. You can have rules light and have it be complex and kind of dense and difficult to decipher, I'm sure. But just simple rules, when you have 100 pages of rules, the character creation process alone is 17 steps. Now, admittedly, I think a few of those are considered optional, but they all do have some sort of mechanical intersection that are going to interact with the mechanics. So I guess that's my question. It's not even a long analysis or anything. Just would you consider to be a simple rule system? How many rules would you have to have? What kind of page count? At what point would you say, well, even with descriptive stuff, this page count is not a simple system? So there it is. What do you think? This is my attempt at wrapping up Muster, a Primer for War, advice for playing D&D in the wargaming way. And it's been, 2 or 3 episodes, I think, since the last time I touched on this, as I've been trying to mull over what is the wargaming way. So I went into the book expecting to see a lot of emphasis on what I think of in my wargaming thought patterns as logistics, which in RPG speak is usually referred to in terms of inventory management and encumbrance. You can't take everything with you. You need to have the supplies that you need to continue your adventure for as long as possible until you return. And that emphasis on logistics also includes things that are part of the party, that are endemic to the party. Things like your health, your hit points in the case of Dungeons and Dragons, and spell slots, and how many arrows you have, as much as how many arrows you have or how much food you have. And I was expecting more of an emphasis on that and tactics as well, using tactics, smart tactics to overcome, not just in combat, but in terms of overcoming challenges, which is where those two things interface. The inventory management and the tactics go together in that space. Do you have your 10-foot pole? Do you have your 50 feet of rope? Do you have 150 feet of rope? Because obviously, if you run across an obstacle that takes more than 50 feet, if you only have 50, you'd find another way around it. And what I found was there was talk about those things, but there was also talk about other things. And I'm going back to page 27 for a minute. The Wargaming Way Wall of Wisdom. 3 cornerstones. Neutral referee, under which is no fudging, dynamic balance, hygienic procedure, authentic participation. With hygienic procedure being refereeing practice where you intentionally choose methods, procedures, and rules that reduce the possibility of unconscious bias in the referee decision making, so that not only are you not biased, hence the no fudging rule, but you are also avoid the you avoid the appearance of impropriety in what you're doing, hence the no fudging rule. That's what the no fudging rule is, not what I just said. And with authenticity being, and this is coming from page 174, that previous part was from the glossary, procedural hygiene. But this part is from page 174 in terms of authenticity. The purpose of playing in the Wargaming Way is to set up a meaningful scenario and resolve it with the group's own wisdom and judgment. I call it authenticity when this happens. The opposite of authentic gaming is experiencing what amounts to a media presentation created in advance. And then the dynamic balance part being, what if instead of assuming the referee is responsible for game balance, we allow the group to discover scenario balancing through the activity of play? This is on page 135. This is a traditional part of extended open world D&D. Adventurers discover opportunities to adventure, research these opportunities, and make choices. And so the player decisions are as much a part of the balancing act as the referee decisions, because the referee's job there is just simply to provide the information available to the players, so that if they choose to do proper scouting, for lack of a better term, before they go off on an adventure, they are better prepared for what comes along. And so balancing is not simply a matter of the referee judging numbers and hoping that things work out. So the second cornerstone he's got listed here is simulation play. Rulings, not rules. Rules are cruft. Teach reality, use reality. In another part of the book, the author goes into how he views that the campaign should be considered the central part of this type of role-playing. So not what rule set you choose, not what adventure or module you pick up, not what book type resources you have available to you, but discussion when you start a campaign of what you're wanting to explore, what type of world you're wanting to explore, what type of concepts you're wanting to explore, and then following everything up from there, choosing the rule set from there, choosing the other resources you have to provide adventures from there, and then making the world, for lack of a better term, real. Not necessarily simulating every little tiny thing, but making the world come alive in a way that the players are getting the experience they wanted to get from it. Whether it's high fantasy or sword and sorcery, or very low fantasy setting where magic is rare and maybe looked upon with suspicion all the time. And then the third cornerstone is real achievement. Players win and lose. XP is real score. Learn sportsmanship, learn about stuff. And I think that, again, ties into what I was talking about with making the campaign central to what you're trying to accomplish. And then below those 3 cornerstones on that same page 17 as party management, quick character creation, start at first level, no backstories, characters die, retire, use character stables, use hirelings and retainers, and also simulation model, realistic baselines, random starting stats, XP is goal-based, leveling models, heroic stature, geometric level progression, linear HP gain, sublinear damage gain. So I think really what maybe separates the wargaming way from, say, OSR or older school concepts is the idea of the world you're exploring and of making the campaign and that world you're in the center rather than anything else that has to do with the game. Throughout the book, the writer often talks about being authentic to the fiction. So this kind of assumes that you're being inspired, maybe not by a specific work, maybe you're not specifically inspired by The Lord of the Rings or Star Wars or Indiana Jones, but that there are tropes or ideas in fiction or maybe even in history that you want to tie together in a fantasy setting and explore through a rule set like D&D. And I think where this really ties into it being part of the wargaming way, at least in my mind, is when you read wargamers talking about why they are playing a particular game or while they're playing a type of game, you will hear a lot about wanting to explore that time frame, war making in that time frame, whether it's 16th century, 17th century, the age of the Roman Empire, pre-Roman Empire, the medieval period, World War II, modern day conflicts, near future conflicts, hypothetical conflicts like things with the Cold War went hot, that a lot of times war games are being used as a way to explore history, usually specifically in a war-making aspect, but also maybe sometimes in terms of a geopolitical situation, economic realities of war, things like that. So I think that's really maybe what separates it. It's not necessarily let's go blast aliens or let's go be heroes that slay dragons and save maidens, but a case of what would it be like to be in a dangerous world like this and explore aspects of it through our characters with, yes, combat probably being a very high amount of focus on it, but also using that just as a stage to explore the world as well as adventurers in a world where there is danger around every corner. I'm still not sure all that makes sense, even to myself, but that's the broad strokes of what I've gathered from this book. And I'd love to hear your opinion on it, if you've read it or if you've just been following along and something has clicked in your head that maybe I'm not seeing. So there it is. That is probably the last time I'll talk about Muster unless something new comes up or, of course, in response to the call-ins that I may or may not get. So thank you for bearing with me for this. This was something that I thought, well, it may go beyond OctoSR, and it certainly did, because here we are in March, and I'm just finishing it up. Although I think my last podcast on it may have been at the very end of February. But it was quite a journey, and I enjoyed it, and I want to thank everyone who has come in, has sent in messages, and called in, and otherwise participated in this exploration. So there we go. And now, more from my solo AD&D RPG campaign, Tales of the Dragon Slayers. Day 114, the Second Battle of the River Keep. Based on the information they obtained from the mercenaries from the merchant caravan that tried to push through the Gnoll Alliance, the allied force of the troops from the fort, nomads, and the regiments of the party, along with Gus and Edgar, approached the river keep with a plan. A fusillade of arrows against the gnolls of the keep, followed by assault by heavy infantry with cavalry exploiting openings. The light infantry would guard against orc attack should they still be present. Initially, things seemed to go well. The gnolls had split their forces between keep and forest. Fort light cavalry and nomad lancers followed up the initial volley of arrows and quarrels. The light infantry surrounded the orc caves. Heavy infantry marched toward the keep, and the party cavalry and nomad leadership positioned themselves to aid as needed. The initial clash seemed to go well. High winds, which I adjudicated to add an additional -1 to the hit rolls per range band, but the high winds largely blunted the ranged fire from both sides, although the gnolls' great bows, by rolling several 20s, killed several members of the nomad leadership. But the initial cavalry charge was very successful. The gnolls, however, had learned a lesson from the previous battle, dividing their force into 3 large units versus small to blunt the morale effects of losses through strength in numbers. They responded with a brutal counterattack that induced the inexperienced Fort Light cavalry to surrender. They sent a pack of hyenodons to attack, followed up by another group of gnolls with 2-handed swords and polearms, Naginata. Luckily, this group was too far to reach the heavy cavalry, infantry, or warrior leadership quickly. But then, emerging from the orc cave, 4 Ettins attacked. In the swirl of combat, Gus and the heavy cavalry charged and killed most of the hyenodons. Edgar trapped most of the second gnoll unit with Entangle, while the nomad leaders engaged the rest. The nomad lancers fiercely fought the gnolls in the woods, covering the escape of the light infantry and forcing the gnolls to withdraw toward the keep. The Ettins inflicted heavy losses on the Green Fort spearmen, multiple kills per blow. This was something I added before I've added that charging into a dense group of opponents, you can carry through your attack if it's successful, if you have enough damage to carry over. I did the same thing with Ettins, figuring their size would allow them to do something like that. But the Ettins inflicted heavy losses on the Green Fort spearmen and some of the full-strength party light infantry. All save the lieutenant of the party's force threw down their weapons, dropped to their knees, and begged for mercy. As the heavy infantry regiments reversed their march to deal with the Ettins, the party's half-strength light infantry attacked the Ettins from the rear. Allied archers fired on the Ettins with no effect. In the middle of the battlefield, some heavy cavalry finished off the hyenodons as Gus and the others joined the nomad leadership and a charmed gnoll leader in finishing off the remaining gnoll infantry beyond. Nomad horse archers harassed the gnolls retreating from the woods, while the nomad lancers followed up. Gnoll bowmen killed some cavalry as the nomad leaders and Gus's force closed and attacked. Edgar successfully entangled 2 of the Ettins, but the other 2 inflicted terrible losses on the infantry opposing them. But the understrength light infantry, having broken versus the orcs at the party's keep, held their morale and fought to the last man, only their lieutenant and sergeant surviving. At the gnoll keep, the gnolls' infantry surrender is interrupted by a small group of gnolls from within the keep attacking the lancers from behind. With Gus and the cavalry having the gnoll archers under control, the nomad leaders joined their fellows in slaughtering this last group of gnolls. Then they ran down the escaping gnoll infantry, and all the gnolls surrendered. The Ettins fell to the ever-increasing number of heavy infantry, along with the light infantry leadership. The Allied force discovered only females and young within the keep, as well as much treasure. The Allied leadership determined that the merchants' trade goods and gold would be returned to them, with the remaining treasure being split by the party and the nomads. The fort troops would receive the bounties to be collected on the gnolls. The nomads refused recompense, preferring to take their battle as a way of reducing their indenture to the king. The party heavy infantry and cavalry and the fort heavy infantry and archers were left at the keep until more garrison troops could arrive. The gnolls were put to work burning their dead and loading the treasure and goods into the captured merchant wagons. And with that, the battle of the River Keep, second battle of the River Keep, was successful. The opening music of this podcast is Strength of the Titans And the closing music is Late Night Radio, both by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0 license. Thank you for listening to Phantom Thoughts. I would love to hear your feedback. You don't have to be part of the show. If you want to contact me and let me know, hey, these are for your eyes only. I just wanted to give you thoughts, ideas, response, and it's really for your eyes or ears only. That's absolutely fine. I'd love to hear from you either way. So just let me know when you contact me. I don't want to be part of the show. There are lots of different ways you can contact me. You can send me an email at phantomthoughtspodcast@gmail.com. And that can be a regular email, or you can attach an audio file to it. You can use the message button on my podcast site on podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/phantom thoughts. You can contact me via my Google Voice number, 864-209-1441. You can contact me via SpeakPipe at www.speakpipe.com/phantom thoughts. You can contact me on Discord, The Pink Phantom. All this contact information is listed in the show notes of every episode. And thank you for those who call in. Thank you for those who don't call in. I appreciate you listening and hope you'll listen again next time. Until then, I hope you have a great day.